we have here Collin Cornell and Eleonora Hoff, if I pronounce it right. Yeah. And they both worked on the biblical ABCs of Miskotte. And the first question is if you can introduce yourself a little bit more. Let's start with Collin.
Sure, yeah. So, Collin Cornell, and my actual area of scholarship and discipline in which I was trained is Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. I earned my PhD from Emory University, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. I defended in 2018, so that was already well into this Miskotte translating project as it happens. And after that, I taught for 3 years as a visiting professor of biblical studies at a small Anglican seminary in the state of Tennessee. And now I've transitioned into a different role, working for a sort of center for religion and environment that's housed within that same US seminary. So that's kind of my academic background, is in biblical studies. But I've maintained an interest in theology and specifically in constructive use of the Bible since that time.
Thank you. And Eleonora?
I'm Eleonora Hoff. I'm pastor in Yper in Belgium for the United Protestant Church of Belgium. I started my theological training in Belgium as well, in Leuven at the Evangelical Theological Faculty. After finishing my bachelor's, I pursued a master's in Bible translation. And Bible translation, in a way, has always been my first love, and I'm still very involved, for example, in following the New Dutch Bible translation. And while I pursued my my Master of Theology, I was also very interested in Christian student work. So for me, theology has never been purely academic. I really think it's very important to maintain the connection with actual faith communities. After my master's, I started my PhD in theology at the Protestant Theological University, first in Utrecht, and I finished in Amsterdam. The topic of my PhD was post-colonial missiology, and I wrote about a theology from the margins, so not from the center, but from the margins as a place where God is found and where God is present. And after much deliberation, I felt called to pursue the call to ministry, and since August 2018, I'm a pastor, first in training and later on ordained in Yper.
Thank you very much. And suddenly you were both into this Miskotte project. Where does your love for Miskotte come from?
Well, it's not so suddenly. It was actually a long time in making, I would say. I come from a background that places a lot of emphasis on translation, Bible translation in particular. My aunts and uncle were long-time Bible translators in the Pacific, for example. So this interest has always been there, and my master's thesis in Bible translation features the topic of the so-called Amsterdam School of Theology, and I trace the difference in translation approach between the so-called Amsterdam School and the Dutch Statenvertaling, which you could say is more or less equivalent in scope to the King James translation. Because both of those translation approaches are very literal, but their meaning of what literal means is pretty different. So in that sense, I came across Miskotte and the biblical ABCs, and it actually stayed a dormant interest during my my further studies. It did not really feature in my PhD. at all. But the wonderful thing about doing a PhD is that at one point in time, the PhD is actually finished and defended, and that opens up a whole new world of possibilities of research interests that can resurface again. So I was invited to present a paper at a conference at the PThU in early 2017, and I was very happy to return to my old love, so to say, and to write about Miskotte, especially since the biography had just come out, so there was a lot of new grounds to break. And I uploaded my my paper that I gave on academia.edu. That's the the premier website where you're able to share your academic papers with others. And Collin read that paper, so he can actually take it from there.
Yes, sure. So just to backtrack a little bit, Eleonora and I actually share some similar preparation in that she and I both had done an internship in Nepal, and we're in Kathmandu around the same time. I think Eleonora left a little bit earlier than I did, but I was kind of working as a junior consultant essentially for Wycliffe there. I was in Nepal for 9 months and helping a translation team to work their way through the Gospel of Mark, translating into a Nepalese language. And I was there because I was exploring that possibility of seeking to become a Bible translator overseas. That was a way for me to hold together the worlds of kind of linguistics and love for scripture and service to Christ. And that was sort of the template I had was Bible translation. And it was while I was there in Nepal that somebody that we both know in common, I think, who was herself a translation consultant, showed me a paper she had written in seminary. And it was about the story of the golden calf in Exodus 32. And really opened my eyes to the depths, the riches of the Old Testament. And that was the beginning of, for me, wanting to return to study the Old Testament more intensively, which I did then when I got back to the United States by attending Princeton Seminary. And it was there that I also became exposed initially to theologians such as Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and some others from that mid-century dialectical theological school. And also another important theologian in that train that was very influential on me was the American Old Testament scholar and biblical theologian Brevard Childs, who perhaps in a very distant parallel to the Amsterdam school emphasizes the formal shape of scripture is really important theologically. So not just trying to reconstruct the history that lies behind scripture or leveraging various kind of socio-political models or what have you, but seeking to attend to the warp and woof of scripture as it lays on the page in its own presentation. And so that was important for me. It was through scholars who were involved in retrieving Brevard Childs' legacy that I ran across Miskotte. Brevard Childs actually approvingly quotes Miskotte, which is unusual in English language contexts. And so it was through him and through some students of his that I ran across Miskotte's name. And as early as 2013, actually, a colleague and friend of mine, Philip Sumter, who's a British-German national, advised me to read Miskotte and showed me a paper on Miskotte that a German theologian, Susanna Hennecke is her name. She had written a paper on Miskotte. And that was the very first introduction I had, but it wouldn't be until much later during 2016 that I would turn my attention more fully to Miskotte. And that was partially through this paper that Eleonora has already mentioned. I was in search of theologians who would take the Old Testament with utter seriousness, who were interested in God, the person, the profile of God, and who really proposed a strong resistance to powers that are destructive to human and non-human life. That was especially urgent for me. 2016, you might or might not remember, in the US was quite a tumultuous time. Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, summer 2016, massive agitation and unrest in American cities. And then of course, fall 2016, the election in the United States was a real turning point and a gut check. And it became much more urgent for me to dedicate my expertise to sort of theologizing resistance. And so all those factors came together in reading this paper that Eleonora had presented. And I reached out to her and started to correspond with her about Miskotte. And it happened that she was going to be in a US city that was about 2 hours from Atlanta. And so we actually met in person in that fall of 2017. And it was during our first in-person meeting, I believe, that Eleonora mentioned biblical ABCs, that it's not translated. It really should be translated. It's a short, urgent work by Miskotte. It's very well known in the Netherlands. It's gone through 8 reprintings there. And there's versions in Latvian and Czech and all these other languages, but not in English. And so that's when we first raised this possibility of translating biblical ABCs.
Thank you. So I was wondering, when I heard about the translation, I thought, why Miskotte? Why now? And when I saw your website, it said, why study another dead white guy? And I felt a bit caught because I thought the same. So I was wondering, what made you think this is the theologian we have to translate in English?
I'm so happy that you're actually bringing it up. That's really awesome, because we anticipated that a lot of people would think that, okay, yeah, there's like so many dead white guys, and I myself a feminist theologian, as is Collin, by the way. So for us, it's also very important to have female theologians represented in discussions. So it's very counterintuitive to translate another dead male white guy, obviously, but to give Miskotte his proper credentials, he actually wrote a fairly early article in the 1950s when discussion in the Nederlandse Hervormde Kerk, the Dutch Reformed Church, was raging about women's ordination, and he was very, very much in favor of it. So that kind of like puts him squarely in the direction where we want to theologize with him. But why we think that he's so important is especially the theme of resistance, and that coupled with the rising anti-Semitism. Collin was already mentioning the unrest in 2016-17 that's really now has subsided, I would say, and especially in Charlottesville, when right-wing persons and actual Nazis were marching through the streets and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." That was the most open display of anti-Semitism yet, I would say. So we were thinking that Miskotte is such an influential voice in denouncing anti-Semitism, also on very theological grounds. So we thought that it would be a voice that would be necessary to be heard, not just in the academic world, but also for pastors who are grappling with those issues in their pastoral presence.
Yeah, I think all that's right. And yes, the Charlottesville event, what it really was, I mean, that's in a certain way marks the beginning of the project for Eleonora and for me. And it's only too telling, I think, that we closed out the project, really completed our first draft finally, right after January 6th in the United States, which is, again, a very significant sort of date to think that that's the span of this project together. But I also wanted to add, I remember early on, in early days, I was trying to read through Miskotte's bibliography, all his writings, and I got hold of the German translation of Edda and Torah. And I saw right away that Miskotte is talking about right-wing authors who were very obscure actually now, but I had run across them in 2017 because these were some of the folks whose names were starting to crop up again in conversations around, like, say, Steve Bannon, who was at that time, I think, one of Donald Trump's right-hand henchmen. And so just to say that there was a real sense of the contemporaneity of these resurgent forces of anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and so on. And so there was, for me, just speaking very personally, I tried my hand as kind of an activist. I was in the streets. I was acting as a peace marshal. I was arrested in 2016. And I was also pursuing doctoral work and trying to hold these worlds together and trying to discern myself. How can I, as myself, with this training, contribute? And so I am already trained in scripture. I am already interested in theology. How can I, with those skills, actually do something specific to me? And so working with Miskotte in translation, given my training, given my familiarity already with the sort of dialectical Bardian outlook and all that, it seemed like it was just a real confluence of those factors that were specific to me and also to Eleonora, this Bible translation background, this interest in a certain school of modern Protestant theology, and then our moment where we are, that we are facing some pretty powerful, destructive, right-wing forces in our societies. It just seemed like it was a lot of things that came together.
Oh, impressive to hear it in such a context, I think, because indeed the work of Miskotte is written in in also a very challenging time, of course. How did you experience the rereading and the translation while we live in 2021 and how we have to cope with our own crisis, for example?
I could speak to that first, Eleonora. Just I would say for myself that I feel like my encounters with Miskotte really started on the front end of our translation project, as I read through all of his works, tried to understand When the Gods Are Silent. Edda and Torah made a real impression on me. I still feel like I want to return to that and figure out more what's happening in that book, and some of the other sort of bits and pieces of his hermeneutical writings and so on. So I feel like it was early on that I received this impression of who this person was, what his theological project is, and then also for me, at the end, in the last couple months, actually, after completing our translation and rereading it in English, just kind of sitting down. I have chapters now to read through. And then that's, again, a moment when I experienced, again, sort of the power of his theological vision. In the intervening years, I'll be honest, I was so caught up in the details that I couldn't really see the entire forest, for the trees. Just trying to tinker with individual sentences and paragraphs. And our discussions were quite technical. I mean, Eleonora and I are friends, so we had just, friend conversations, but our Miskotte conversations were quite detailed, So I feel like it's at either end for me that I sort of reacquainted with this vitality of Miskotte's theological outlook.
Yeah, thank you so much, Collin. For me, there's really two focal points, I would say. So the one focal point is what we already discussed, is the desire to really make a contribution in combating anti-Semitism and right-wing forces in society. But the other focal point has more to do with my own vocation as a minister in a parish at the moment. And especially the final chapter on church communities is very poignant, because Miskotte laments that there are churches and there are believers, but there are not really communities, not really congregations. And I think it's really vital to actually equip congregations in the reading of the Bible, of really spelling the foundational words. So it has kind of become a programmatic book for me as well in my own ministry. And I'm ministering in in a Catholic context. So that means that so many people lack a very basic knowledge of the Bible, especially of the Old Testament, and they don't have a really integrated vision. They know some of the most well-known biblical stories, obviously, but they don't really know the grand narrative of Scripture. And it has been actually pretty empowering for them as well to try to understand a bit of the larger whole. And to my surprise, they never really have gotten the chance to actually explore the Bible as a whole of literature with foundational words. And for me, kind of a turning point was when I discussed with my Bible study group the structure of the book of Exodus. And I also obviously touched on Exodus 3 with the revelation of the name. And so the people knew about the whole burning bush story. That's kind of like a story that's imprinted in like elementary school. That story gets told, but none of them actually had an idea how foundational that story is to basically the whole Torah, where it is the revelation of the name. It is the I am who I am, I will be who I will be. And so I kind of found in Miskotte the articulation of what I want to do as a minister as well, to really equip people to read the scriptures and to spell the name, and to also to really let them explore who God is. Because what I really like about Miskotte is kind of like this agnosticism about the nature of God, because he says that we cannot know a priori who God is. We cannot know that God is almighty, all-powerful, all-seeing, all whatever. We can only know God if that's actually revealed and if we actually can read about that. So there's like so many misconceptions about God that are floating around here, so very distant ideas about who God is. And I usually just tell people, well, I don't believe in this kind of God that you don't believe in, so we're equal. We both don't believe in that kind of God. And then it opens up a space where we can actually read the Bible and actually go read what it says about God. So Miskotte has tremendously helped me in my own pastoral work, I would say.
Just to tag on that, if I may, one sort of area that I found Miskotte helpful in the intervening years as a teacher. I've been a teacher, and I am still now too in seminary contexts, is that Miskotte makes room in biblical ABCs, in his other writings, there's the preaching moment, the proclamation, the kerugma, and that's extremely important, integral, pivotal. But he also has this entire vision for catechesis, for teaching, for preparation, that you have to sort of familiarize people with the contours, the shape of Scripture for that moment to actualize and to happen. And so for myself too, I found that he has a very teacherly ethos, and that's been encouraging and helpful to me, is just equipping students with basic Bible kind of knowledge, the layout of Scripture, giving them a framework to hang the individual bits and pieces on is immensely important. And Miskotte values that and sees that as preliminary to the event of God, of sort of God's arrival in speech, in preaching.
Nice.
Yes, I like that very much. That it's not only academic but also very practical for a preacher and for students, for young students. I was wondering about the translation process. Can you tell something about your general experiences, or like the challenges you meet?
What we how we started is that I provided a very rough drafts from Dutch to English, and Collin basically made it proper, fluent, contemporary English. And so that's like the basic process, but there was a lot of back and forth, and we've been going through a lot of different versions to try to get everything consistent. And because the whole idea of the foundational words, the grondwoorden, is so important, we also try to be as consistent as possible. So we had many deliberations on how to exactly translate some of those foundational words. So yeah, just as Collin said, there's been a lot of nitty-gritty details in the translation, but our emphasis was always that the English should be very readable to contemporary readers. And what I'd like to say to students actually is that most Dutch students who are pretty fluent in English will actually find the English more readable than the Dutch, because the Dutch is a very much the Dutch from 1941 and not contemporary Dutch. So, and especially there's a huge difference in sentence structure between Dutch and English. And in general, it's more easy to make long running sentences in Dutch than it is to English. And Miskotte used that capacity to the max. So some of his sentences are so long and they just meander on and on and on. So we had to cut those sentences short and restructure them. So it's usually, at least as far as we are concerned, it's a bit easier to follow in English, even for Dutch speakers, I would say.
Yeah, I thought one of the compliments that I've been thinking about most from the conference last week was Phil Ziegler actually said that he felt as if the theologians, the pastors, the students who were present were treating Miskotte as a contemporary, not just a historical figure that we had learned some arcane facts about, but as someone who's kind of speaking for our current situation, for our now life before God. I thought that's probably the remark that I've sort of really taken with me. But that's to Eleonora's point that we wanted it to be understood, the translation, as a proposal. This is a way that you can try on to think about, to live with God, to be responsible before God, rather than as just a historical artifact, a piece from the past. And our translation is partly just a matter of English. The way the English sentences go, it requires certain adaptations. But it's also programmatic for us too, I would say. And in terms of the process, Eleonora is right. That was sort of the basic two-step, but very, I would say, spiraling. We sort of always, all this back and forth and push and pull about, how to render this sentence or that paragraph. And into that spiral, we oftentimes would bring the antecedent of Heinrich Stuyvesant's German translation, which is, I would say, also more intelligible than the Dutch. So he too has made a lot of choices before us to sort of, clarify and, just make a choice about a lot of the ambiguities in Miskotte's own prose. And so that was part of our process too, was factoring in English grammar and syntax and word choice. Also, though, this German precedent was important too.
Yes, and if Miskotte used examples that are very specific to the Dutch context, we supplied some footnotes. So we try to keep the footnotes to minimum, but we think that the footnotes that we provided will be helpful for readers that are not familiar with the Dutch context. Yeah.
I would say too, we also took some consolation from the fact that the previous English translations, there's only two of them really, the Roads of Prayer and When the Gods Are Silent. They too, I would say, stepped towards the direction of a dynamic translation, rather than truly trying to mediate the Baroque, complicated, meandering prose that Miskotte, had. And two, that Miskotte himself signed off on these translations, not necessarily the English one, yes, he did, but these German translations, he himself kind of authorized as, canonical representations of his own project.
Yes, and also we try to limit some of the emphasis because for Miskotte everything becomes extremely important. So he uses a lot of italics, and then he uses, what's the word, like the marks on the letters themselves where they get emphasis, and that really doesn't work in English. So the text is a little bit more readable. Sorry, what's the English word for that?
Italics? I don't know.
No, not italics, but like on the E's, he
little accent, grave accent.
Yes,
or,
that, yeah. And that doesn't
Yeah.
really work in English. So it's a little bit more structured, I would say, at the moment. But the real emphasis still comes through where he wanted it.
Yes. And we were very scrupulous, actually, to make sure all the same headings appear, to make sure the italics. I mean, we went through, scrubbed it right at the very end to make sure all the places he has italicized are italicized in our version. So, we were quite exacting. It was not sloppy work at all.
Nope.
Nice. That's great. Right into the details. It's almost if he wrote it himself in English.
Hopefully, yes.
Cool. So, did you encounter some ideas of Miskotte in his work that are outdated for this time?
I'll speak to two examples possibly of that. One that, again, just thinking about some of the conversations at the conference, that it seemed as if many readers, English language readers, encountering Miskotte for the first time, had a lot of questions about his category of paganism, which is, of course, not original to him. He's borrowing it from Max Brod and from Franz Rosenzweig, who both use it. But at the same time, the current day theologians found it both very provocative, very generative, but also risky. That's a category that has a lot of Orientalism, Orientalizing, a lot of othering, a long polemical history built into it. And so that's one that I wouldn't say it's necessarily outdated, but to use paganism constructively in a current day context where indigenous peoples are fighting to protect, say, a lot of the world's remaining rainforests and tracts of land, to just say paganism in ways that could be misunderstood to somehow denigrate or put down indigenous kinds of practice, traditional knowledges, is very, very dangerous. So that's one that's, I don't know if it's outdated, but deserves a lot of caution, a lot of explanation, a lot of repurposing. In my view, I don't think we need to set it aside, but to really be careful with it. That's one. And then I would say too, and maybe Eleonora can perhaps fill in more on this one, but there are occasional moments in Miskotte, besides his pervasive use of masculine language. That's one that's just, especially for English language readers, feels very antiquated. That he's in a world where he's only thinking about men as the default reader and person and theologian, and using he, him exclusively for God just belongs to his own era rather than, I think, to our own. And in other instances too, Miskotte will just casually pick up on some either orientalizing or othering or just very sort of dated set of cultural references. Like, for example, one that we talked a lot about was when he compares kind of running with the concept of the infinite to, it's as if it appears demonic, its sort of demonic character appears as if it is an African mask. And he's thinking of a specific, kind of wooden African mask. And that's obviously just the case where a sort of artifact, a practice from an indigenous, tradition, just as a shorthand for him for something evil. And it's just the casual, comparison that he makes, but it's a moment of cultural chauvinism that I think shows through. So Eleonora, I'm sure, can say more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's for us it was pretty baffling because it really didn't fit in the overall text, but I think that really shows how much he's on the one hand a child of his time, but on the other hand also very much ahead of his time. So he kind of like goes between those two extremes, I would say. But I definitely think that there's much more research that needs to be done in regards to Miskotte and colonialism. There is also a pretty complicated history there, but he traveled to Indonesia already before the war, and he was also vocal in denouncing colonialism. But he also, in his diaries, for example, he runs with some very outdated objectifying Orientalist tropes, especially when it comes to for example, the fertility of Native women in Indonesia, and those are pretty cringy to read, I would say. So yeah, there's definitely stuff to unpack there.
Yeah. It's very interesting, again, on this same note, that about paganism and colonialism and how all this is very complexly interacting for him, because the lectures that became Edda and Torah, he gave first on this Indonesia trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's identifying himself as a pagan at the same time as he's giving lectures in Indonesia. And at the same time as he's saying Torah interrupts that sort of, default human outlook that is pagan. So that's a very complicated and opposing Germanic, the Edda as the sort of epitome of the pagan outlook. So yeah, just to say there's a lot more to unpack, as Eleonora says there.
Yeah,
Wow.
those are very interesting things. For me, as a feminist theologian, I will always find it difficult to really engage with theologians who are clearly child of their time. There's so much translation to be done before I can use it. So, but I'm glad that you notice these things, like it's not going to be scraped on the carpet or or something,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
it isn't there. So yeah, thank you for those answers.
Mm-hmm.
So another question, and maybe the last question already. If there's one key message in the biblical ABCs, which one would you want to share with the world?
I will say, maybe provocatively, and following up on an earlier part of this conversation, that we have a lot of unbelieving to do. That there's a very thorough critical outlook in biblical ABCs, which is that we have to first be shaken loose from kind of the status quo, ambient, default worldview. And so he says, he frames sanctification in terms of unbelieving, that God makes the elect people unbelieving people. And he means that with reference to the unbelieving that we have to do with regard to all the structures and powers and kind of default pre-given beliefs of our society. We have to be distanced from all that, and that somehow believing, trusting, obeying God requires that of us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Collin. If I would answer that, well, it would be obviously what he writes in the first chapter, like the program is just back to the ABCs, to the simple grondlijnen, the ground lines of Holy Scripture, and actually living out of it. So that's what he states as his goal. But in regards to what he, in regards to I think the denouncements of the existing, so that the existing order is not the order as it should be or would be, and that God is actually the saboteur, and God breaks through all our existing categories, and especially the categories of Bluts und Boden. And I think that's the most relevant message for our time as well. So God does not equate it cannot be equated with the existing order.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear how you have experienced this whole translating process, and it's very inspiring to hear that it feels like working on this book also really impacted your life and the way you see the world and how you want to be a theologian. If I also a little bit see my notes and your answers, so I can only thank you for being so kind and open to answer our questions.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks to you both.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the initiatives.